Welcome to our little red schoolhouse. Try to imagine going to school in one room with 8 grades and only one teacher. That's exactly how it would have been for the young scholars who attended school here when it was built in 1837. The school was placed in a rural area just off a road near a woods, exactly like this. But it was such a remote location, the school commissioners had to move the school. Before we go inside though, please take a note of the necessary next door. In 1837 there would have been 2, one for boys and one for girls. All right, let's go inside. Okay, first let's try and put what we're seeing into a little bit of perspective with some history of education in the United States and in New York State, and especially in Schoharie County. As early as 1795, it had become obvious that general education, reading, writing, and arithmetic, was essential for all of the population. Interest in education increased by the early 19th century, and as a result, the first public secular school in the country was founded by New York City Mayor DeWitt Clinton and others in 1805. Similar initiatives spread to other cities and then to smaller centralized areas like Jefferson and neighboring Stamford. Towns in Schoharie County began to support academies for large numbers of local students and offer more advanced courses. The first academy in Schoharie County was built in 1811 to 1812 here in Jefferson. You may have seen the historic marker on Main Street next to the village green where the Methodist Church stands now. In 1812, New York adopted laws for dividing and organizing each town into school districts, building schoolhouses and hiring teachers. The Jefferson Academy closed its doors in 1854, but by that time there were one-room schoolhouses throughout the county. In 1866, the town of Jefferson had 13 school districts with a total of 574 students. That works out to about 44 students per school. This one-room schoolhouse, which was built in 1837, continued in operation for almost 100 years until 1935, when it was finally closed. New York State began centralizing school districts then, and students were transferred to Jefferson Central School. The new Central School was located next to the village green where the old Jefferson Academy had been, and where the Methodist Church stands now. We understand that early on, most teachers were men. Teaching didn't pay a great deal, however, and as time went by, women began to teach as well. School boards tended to hire the women to teach in the spring, summer, and fall, when the older boys were busy on the farm. They tried to hire men to teach in the winter because they felt a male teacher could handle the older boys better than women. Attendance was very irregular, depending on planting and harvesting seasons as well as the weather. We've been told that on a good day, this school had about 25 to 30 students. Some pupils, they were called scholars in those early days, attended nearly all year, while others, especially the older boys, attended only when farm work was done. Students were often out sick as well, since there was little knowledge of sanitary practices. So diseases like smallpox, polio, measles and mumps, and diphtheria kept many children at home. Effective medicines, such as antibiotics, hadn't been discovered yet. Then there were young scholars who didn't care much for school. A gentleman named Bouck White wrote in 1910 about his early days in the Catskill Mountains. Here's what he said: "I didn't get much schooling, somehow never took to it. In fact, there wasn't much book learning to take to in those days. When you've got to walk 3 miles for it, the amount of book learning you're going to bring back with you isn't going to be very hefty. And when a boy brings home a good string of fish for the table, his ma isn't going to scold him much for going to play hooky from school." Students who attended one-room schools in this area in the 1930s have told us that their morning would start with the older students putting the flag out on a pole. Then they would all say the Lord's Prayer and end by singing America. Some schools, like this one, had a front hallway where students could hang their coats and leave their boots and umbrellas, and where they could store wood for the stove during the wintertime. Notice there are two doors, one for the boys' side of the room and one for the girls' side of the room. In the morning, one of the boys would usually go to the nearby farmhouse or well and get water for the students during the day. One of the girls who went to school at Schoolhouse told it this way. The older boys took turns coming over to our house every morning to get the ceramic jug filled with water. Each pupil had a cup brought from home which hung on hooks near the water jug. Blackboards were at first made of planed wooden boards painted black, but later some were surfaced with slate. The teacher would hand out assignments to students to be done at their desks. Notice that our desks are stationary wooden ones with attached wooden seats. One former student, Betty Mata-Lavage, who attended the one-room schoolhouse nearby in Schoolhouse, said, "You had to be very careful doing your paperwork, as the desks all had carved mementos from past students, and your pointed pencil could puncture the paper you were writing on." Desks in the center aisle could hold as many as 3 students, and the ones in the side aisles held 1 or 2. Desks were smaller towards the front of the room. As students grew older, they were moved to the larger desks and chairs towards the back of the room. Betty said, "My feet never touched the floor in all the time I was in the various grades." She added, "One grade at a time would go up front for a reading lesson. When it was time to recite, you went up to the front seats where it was nice and warm. The whole front wall was blackboards, and a lot of our work was done up there. For example, writing and arithmetic. The school had a small library of shelves under the chimney. We read those books over and over. We also had a big leather case that contained maps of the world, the continents, the United States, and New York State. Another big leather case contained stamps of the alphabet and small pictures, which the teacher used to make up worksheets for us. In the winter, the schoolhouse was heated by wood supplied by local farmers. One of the older boys would usually come early to start the fire, but the students would have to wear their coats until the schoolhouse warmed up. The teacher sometimes made hot chocolate on the stove for the children during the winter. Students would warm their lunches on the stove and even cook potatoes in the embers for lunch. A former student in Gilboa, here in Schoharie County, described attending their one-room schoolhouse this way. "We had a wood stove we burned wood in, and it was cold. The windows would rattle, and sometimes our lunch would freeze, and we'd warm it up on the stove." There was no artificial light, except on special occasions when kerosene lamps were lit. After the advent of rural electrification in 1936, a few may have had electric light. This school closed in 1935, so it didn't have electricity while it was in use as a schoolhouse. When Fuller District No. 4 was closed in 1935 as a result of school centralization, all of the supplies and materials, including books and bookshelves, were sold at auction. The building then sat neglected for almost 50 years and became in need of repair. Barbara Palmer will tell you what happened next.
The schoolhouse was closed in 1935, and it sat empty, basically unused, but I think someone used it to store hay for a while. Cleo was a school bus driver, and so he drove past that school, which he had attended for 8 years, and he drove by it and kept saying to himself that he'd like to save it, do something with it. In the 1950s, the people that owned it said they'd give it to him as long as they moved it, and he restored it, which he was happy to do. To move it was quite a feat. It was actually in pretty bad shape by then. They took 4 tractors and logs. They jacked it up and got it on logs, and they took the tractors and moved it down the road. It was like not too far, probably a mile and a half, something like that. Then he had to go on to the restoration project, which was big. It took a few years, but not that long. But he replaced a lot of the clapboard on the side. He repainted the inside. People over the years, starting right off the bat, started donating all sorts of things. tried to get things that were accurate to the time, and lots of books. Then they opened it to the public. They built outhouses, little picket fence, planted a rugosa rose, did all the little things to make it nice. And they always had visitors. They had picnics, reunions, classes visited. It was a labor of love, definitely, for Cleo. And he and his first wife, Avis, began the restoration. Then Avis died, and he remarried my mom, whose husband had also died, and it was a passion for her also. By then it was restored, but they were still collecting things and still inviting people over, and really loved it. The fourth grade teacher would bring her kids over for one day because the fourth grade curriculum was New York State history. And she taught the kids a lot about the schoolhouse. They had picnic tables outside, and they go out and play games. And the kids loved it. The town moved it because it was donated to the town. That's what Cleo's wish had been. There was a big truck, and they loaded it on there and had checked out all the wires along the way and all that stuff. And so they loaded it on the big flatbed and brought it up here and deposited it. He was a people person. He was a farmer. He was a Boy Scout leader, school bus driver, Grange member, always involved with something, helping out. And he was really community oriented. Everything kind of just went together as to save an old building and save the history. For one thing, I'm just thrilled that people have become so interested in it, because for a while it was here, but not really cared for. And Bonnie and Clara have just done this remarkable job of pulling some things together to make it even nicer and more historically accurate. And then, with the grant that we received from the Soil and Water people, we've got this really beautiful nature trail that goes by another historic site. So I think it's great for the community to have another beautiful thing to enjoy and to walk through and learn about.